Hello and welcome to Sex Talk with Natasha. I'm Natasha Helfer Parker. Super excited to have, I think, what is a really important topic, very timely, where we will be discussing what men can do to help combat rape culture in this very heated kind of climate that we find ourselves in today, with lots and lots of discussions and feelings and thoughts that are kind of all over the place. So super excited to have Todd Engert joining me tonight. And before I introduce him further or get talking about that, I just have a few announcements for Sex Talk with Natasha. So first of all, I'd just like to again excuse Ashley Pacini, who is the director and producer of the show. She is actually facing some real challenges, health challenges, and I will probably allow her to speak more on that in the future, but if you can just send well wishes to her. She is currently just going through some chemotherapy treatments and things that are quite serious. She has good prognosis, but anyway, just send love her way and make sure you send her a little maybe message even on this thread. I think she'd really appreciate that. We are also going to be making some changes to the format of Sex Talk with Natasha. We've been thinking a lot about who's using this service and what are some ways that we can make this service more accessible, especially for subscribers. So just stay tuned to more announcements about that, but these changes will start next week. We will still do a short version of Facebook Live, probably not quite half an hour's worth, where I will do some bullet points, but then we're gonna move directly into kind of a live webinar so that those who are subscribers can interact with me more and can interact with each other more. So we're wanting to offer that at the $10 pledge a month so that you have 4 sessions a month to be able to do that with, or we're also going to do it individually. So if you don't want to become a subscriber, but you want to, there's a certain topic that really interests you and you just want to come to that one, I guess, event, we'll have a way for you to be able to register for that. So just look forward to some changes. We're trying to, it's been almost a year since I started this project, and we're just trying to find new ways and better ways to serve those who are interested in this kind of production. For those of you who don't know what Sex Talk with Natasha is, it's basically me. I'm a certified sex therapist and a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've been in practice for over 20 years and dealt with a lot of issues around sexuality, relationships, gender identity, sexual orientation, just kind of, you name it, I've probably dealt with it at some level or another. And I find that sexual education for adults is greatly lacking. We kind of didn't get great sexual education as teenagers, most of us. Most of us have had some type of sex negative culture or education that we come from, and therefore we struggle oftentimes, I feel, unnecessarily or tragically in our relationships or our sexual health or the way that we conceptualize sexuality for ourselves. So I'm hopeful that this is a kind of resource that can be of value to those of you who are interested in such a thing. All right, so as far as becoming a subscriber, this is where Ashley usually comes in, so I have to do her job. So becoming a subscriber, you can go to sextalkwithnatasha.com. You can also go to patreon.com /sextalkwithnatasha. All of our resources are basically on both of those areas, and that's how you can access all the different resources at the different subscription levels. And also we're hopeful that you will ask questions. This is supposed to be somewhat interactive. Again, I don't have Ashley with me, but I will try to, check out the messages along the way on the Facebook Live feed. About half an hour in, we will cut Facebook Live and we will continue the rest of the conversation for subscribers on Patreon. So make sure you subscribe before the half hour is up so that you can continue that. If you don't catch it live, you can still catch it. It's always recorded, so you don't have to catch it live. It's just more interactive if you catch it live. All right, without further ado then, I have a few bullet points that I just wanted to share. And then I'd love to hear from Todd, because I think you've shared with me that you have kind of an interest in this and have studied some about this. I'd kind of just like to get your perspective. So when I think about rape culture and the many ways that we've been discussing this, especially in the last few weeks in our country, most of the conversations I've had are with women and the many concerns and fears and discussions that they have about this, and how oftentimes it's very triggering, especially if they're victims of any type of sexual assault or any type of unwanted sexual harassment, that to hear some of the things that have been happening. And I've also heard from a lot of men who are very interested in wanting to become educated about these issues, want to be allies to women in their lives, and want to better be able to address these issues. So my number one thought is really just educating ourselves on what rape culture is. And I'm not going to really go into that tonight. I think I've done that in previous shows, and you can definitely Google some definitions about that. But I think just educating yourself. I know the word rape is a provocative word. So oftentimes it can lead to defensiveness right off the bat. You know, like most men wouldn't consider themselves rapists. So to kind of own the idea that we all participate in rape culture can feel a bit off-putting. And right off the bat, it can be upsetting. At the same time, it's a serious enough issue, and it's a common enough issue that we need to address it head on. So educating yourself about that would be very helpful. I think that whether we realize it or not, we have so much language, jokes, movies, entertainment that really includes language that objectifies or denigrates women. And so becoming more aware about that and avoiding those types of things that you think could be harmless, or that you think, you know, what's the big deal? Or if a woman seems upset about those things, it's kind of like, well, I was just kidding. Why are you going to get so upset? Those are ways that as a woman, and as I've talked to many women, we have kind of been trained to learn how to, and because if we do, then we're going to be told that we're exaggerated or not cool enough, or like, what's our problem? And so to really start kind of thinking about the types of things you say about women, the type of language you use around women, the type of ways you describe females and female issues, and then if called out on that, instead of getting defensive, really getting curious about, well, what was it about that joke or that comment that maybe was offensive, instead of getting defensive yourself. My number 2 tip is really being willing to speak up if you hear other people using this kind of language. Sometimes this language is used amongst men. We've heard about locker talk, you know, locker room talk, or boys will be boys type of talk. So this kind of language or these kinds of messages are being shared in situations where only men are in those positions. So be the one willing to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this line of talk. I'm not comfortable with us talking this way about our girlfriends or our women in general, or our wives, or whatever it is, that you can kind of stand up. And that's hard to do because, you know, you can be seen as the weak one or the silly one or the righteous one, or whatever ways that we shame people who stand up for social justice. But be willing to do that. Be willing to kind of confront other men, correct other men, and just say, you know what, I don't think that's cool. I don't, you know, work on your own confidence so that you can say that in a way that maybe you don't care if somebody who's saying those things thinks you're cool or not. All right, number 3 tip, if you have a friend or a family member who shares with you about anything about a sexual assault experience, please, please, please take them very seriously. Believe them, be concerned about them, ask how you can be supportive. And along with that, what I will add is kind of a sub-tip to this, especially for men who maybe have a daughter or a wife or a girlfriend or somebody who's very close to them. Come to them. Don't be fragile. Don't make it so that now we have to take care of you. So this is you know, I was reading an article the other day that I will link to in my resources page, but where they were talking about why so many women never told their fathers about any type of sexual assault that happened. And the two reasons I picked out the most in that article were, one, I didn't want him to hurt for the experience that I'd had. You know, I don't want somebody who loves me to be so sad or upset that this happened to me. And the number two thing I picked up on is I didn't want my father to potentially risk hurting this person, you know, like becoming violent with this person, and then being afraid that, you know, now my father would have to face assault charges or something along those lines. So that was very hard to read that. And I would assume if you're a father or a loved one of somebody that you would hope would come to you, that you really need to emotionally regulate if somebody is sharing with you something so difficult, so that the person now doesn't have to, on top of telling you something difficult, now take care of you as well. So that can be something to be thinking about. Be willing to be a critical thinker about gender roles, how relationships and how violence is often depicted, again, in our overall culture. So, you know, what gender role stereotypes might I have? What ideas do I have about what it means to be a man or a woman in our culture? How do I either, you know, adhere to those type of gender roles, or maybe how have I had experiences where I wasn't comfortable with those gender roles but still felt the pressure to adhere to them? So be thinking about things as you look at advertisements, movies, listening to songs, about how these messages can oftentimes be very much a part of our culture. So be a critical thinker. I think if you're a male, we are asking you to be respectful of others' physical space. So whether you realize it or not, and I think as I hear a lot of women talking and as I hear a lot of men talking, usually people who have any type of privilege don't really understand what it's like to be in the non-privileged position, right? So for example, it's very common that I hear women saying, you know, I'm nervous in the dark walking out to my car, or I'm nervous in the streets, you know, if it's after dark, or so in other words, I'm aware if there's anybody walking around me. You know, there's been many, many instances in my life where I've heard footsteps behind me and I kind of just posture myself to just make sure I understand who's behind me, what I'm dealing with as far as my environment. I'm not saying that men have never had this experience, but it seems to me like men have this experience a lot less than women. And so if you be more cognizant, so if you're walking behind a woman on a street, be cognizant that she might be nervous about that. Or if you're in a crowded bus or something like that, be cognizant about how you're spacing yourself around other women. Because oftentimes as women, we have been taught to be on the defensive, you know, and we've had enough experiences where we are on the defensive. And so just be cognizant of your own physical space, even in casual situations. And even, obviously, even if you never consider doing something inappropriate, just be aware of that privilege that you have. When it comes, this would be my last tip before I start inviting Todd. So the last one is really about, obviously, consent. And so in all of your relationships with a sexual partner or a romantic interest, be very, very willing to communicate and not ever assume consent. And never assume consent given certain parameters, you know, like, well, she's obviously okay with me kissing or making out, so I think it's okay to go to the next step. Don't just assume those things, right? So be very careful, and there's plenty of ways you can still be romantic and lovely and hot and still be consensual. And we can talk about that maybe, or if you have questions about that, maybe that's even a whole nother show that we do is about how to be sexy and consensual along the way. But I think this is really important because we don't want there to be any assumptions. And again, in our culture, there's been lots and lots of assumptions of what consent looks like. And the classic example that I give that is just so awful is, I think most of us can think of a movie, or at least most of us of a certain age can think of a movie where the man, you know, the woman is upset with the man in some way or another. Yeah, I'm grumpy with you. And he comes in and kind of just hugs her close and kisses her or does something, and she resists and then relaxes into him. I can think of probably at least 4 movies where I saw that type of a scene just off the top of my head. And so those are kind of some of the messages I think that we really need to be aware of that are so harmful to this idea of enthusiastic consent, understanding what consent is in dating relationships and marital relationships and relationships where maybe you're friends, but you're flirtatious, of what is appropriate and what is not, and when you're crossing the line. I said I would say the last thing, but the last thing I will say, and this is kind of goes back to the #1 tip about educating yourself. I just want to be very, very clear that the messages that we've been hearing from certain leaders in our country, that this is a dangerous time for men or boys, young boys, is really not true. And in fact, when we talk about those kinds, when the focus goes onto this idea of false allegations, it really detracts from the actual problem. Now, false allegations do happen, and they happen with every single type of crime out there. And that's always a concern, whether you're, I guess, a drug dealer or a robber or a sexual assaulter. But those statistics are so minimal compared to what we're really talking about when it comes to rape culture. So if when we're having this discussion, that's the first thing you mention as a man, then that in of itself is kind of participating in rape culture. Because again, now we have to worry about this little tiny statistic versus what most women are having to deal with in their regular lives all the time. So if you're afraid about that, or if you're concerned about that, I definitely want to find spaces where we can talk about that, but you have to really put that into text. All right, so those are my ideas, my thoughts for the evening. Todd, hi.
Hi.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How do you come to be on my show tonight? What are you interested in? What questions might you have, etc.?
Well, I found it interesting that you put the, kind of the call out there, and I was interested in participating in the discussion. I didn't plan on being the center or any such thing. Yeah. I think it's an important topic, and I'm seeing a lot of emotion cloud from the real issues that we're facing. And there's a lot of heat, but not a lot of light in the conversation. And I think it's important that men address this issue, that they own it, that they own that they've created an environment that isn't safe, and they have attitudes towards women that are too primitive for our current time. And they're not only dangerous, but they're, harmful, but they're outdated. And the call is being raised right now in the collective voice for women to share their pain, the things they've suffered. And, I try and look at this chronologically. A woman was able to only get a credit card at 71 in 1971. They were only allowed to vote. There's been an evolution of rights, but we're really to where we need to see each other as psychological, spiritual, physical equals. And that just hasn't occurred in the collective yet.
So tell me a little bit about, I so appreciate your thoughts on this. And I think it's so wonderful to hear a male voice, and why I did the call for male voices. And I'm so appreciative, not only of you, several other men offered to come on the show tonight. It didn't work out timing wise or for other reasons, because I was actually thinking about maybe having more than one person on. So you won the lottery, if you want to think about it that way. I don't know. I think that this is quite a vulnerable space for males sometimes to enter into. So I just want to appreciate that and recognize that. So tell me a little bit about what maybe how did you come to even start having some of these ideas, or like where do you come from, how were you educated, and where along the way, like were these ideas you always had, or did you kind of come into some type of shift in your thoughts about this topic?
Well, I don't know where to begin story wise, but I was raised Mormon.
Okay.
I left the church at age 41, which
Okay.
is about 8 years ago. And since that time, I've always been super conscious of, our social issues. And I have a sister that was raped. My girlfriend was raped. I have seen the effects play out in their lives, in their relationships, in their inability to connect. And raised in an oppressive culture, I view myself as a victim of sexual abuse, and I think that's something that needs to come into the conversation, because I think men are wounded with the cultural narrative that is in play, and we need to stop looking at them as perpetrators and labeling them as a group. I think to really begin to deal this issue, we need to be honest, compassionate, and firm. But we need to start looking at what harm is being done to these individuals that they're functioning in this way in our society.
So that's a really interesting perspective, and I'm a big believer of that any type of sexism, although males are privileged from that,
Yeah.
everybody is harmed, right? And so it hurts both men and women to have these types of things kind of prevalent in our culture. It interferes with potential intimacy. It interferes with potential relational success. It interferes with, I think, even the vulnerability of men is oftentimes, when we look at stereotypical gender roles of men, it's not share your feelings, right? It's not be vulnerable. It's more about being aggressive and strong and scoring and, being kind of pushed into this sexual aggressor type of role. And I'm guessing that might have been your experience. Tim Burt says the concern of victims that a male family member might become involved in vigilante retaliation is very common. So it's just a comment I'm making. But do you want to speak to that as far as your experience growing up Mormon and American, as far as what do you think you learned about being a man that now you find problematic?
I think it began with being shown early on not to show your emotions or feel your emotions or carry emotions. And as such, never really learned to process them in a healthy way. It's always put on a brave face, always be more aggressive. And in fact, when males are together, if you're not, you'll get singled out. So there is kind of a pressure on males to conform to a certain stereotype or ideal that we have that is unfortunately a harmful one.
Yeah, when you think about, again, maybe dating myself, but some of the messages we grew up with, like on movies like 16 Candles or Animal House, or it's kind of this idea of, to be a successful male, you've got to drink, for one, drink alcohol, and second of all, be kind of, again, a sexual aggressor, right? Instead of to, again, have conquests per se. Is that, do you relate to that kind of?
I think so. I once again, I kind of come back to the emotional depth, because if you're not able to connect to your own emotions, you're not able to connect to another person's reality. You're not able to see them as another human being because you're not experiencing the human condition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think, being cut off from emotion and then being steered towards aggression and not feeling and towards privilege is a dangerous combination. I think it begins with emotional intelligence. And I think, the so-called feminine side is aspects both genders have.
Mm-hmm.
And we need access to both of those archetypes, if you will, within ourselves. We need to be able to receive and surrender, and we need to be able to assert and stand. They're complementary. And unfortunately, women are in the position of feeling emotion and they tend to look out for the groups, or that's how they're programmed, to look out for their family and the others, not be concerned with themselves. So in a way, they're lacking some of the male energy to stand up for themselves, to assert, to speak up. And I think that might be part of the conversation too, is, you know, we've got to retrain both genders in the full spectrum of what masculine and femininity are within the self and within a relationship and in real life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially because like women who, I mean, this is something that women often report, especially women who are in the career realm or professional realm. If and when they do assert themselves, they're oftentimes either ridiculed or put down or seen as too masculine, right? Or seen as bitchy or naggy, or, you know, these kinds of ways that we belittle a woman's ability to share her voice or to be more of an aggressor. So those are things that I think we all need to be more aware of as well. All right, would you be okay with me just kind of putting you on the spot and asking you questions?
Oh, I'm fine with that. Yeah, that'd be great.
So I'm wondering, as a male, what it's been like over the last few weeks to see some of the maybe social media threads, some of the news stories out there, and in particular responding to other male counterparts that seem to be so upset about the idea of false accusations, or this idea that men should be afraid. Like, what's been your response or reaction, kind of your, I don't know, your own kind of process through that?
Yeah. For the first thing that came up was sadness, you know, and then anger. There's a lot of sadness that so many women have suffered this, that these are our mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts. These, you know, this touches everyone we know. And the fact that men are carrying this out, you know, and there's no way to identify them, just speaks to the sickness that we're dealing with. And I find that somewhat terrifying, and disheartening. And so I've kind of been wrestling with that, like, who are these Neanderthals, you know, that walk amongst us that are dangerous? And when I really look at that, I think they're people that are unhealed. They're people that didn't develop properly, in part because of our cultural narratives and pressures. And so we really need to start having these conversations, if nothing else, to begin to talk about it. And I think that, you know, you mentioned men being afraid. I think that's flipping the script. I think that's a deliberate attempt to stop the narrative. It was used as a political tool to push through a Supreme Court justice and as a partisan power grab. So I think what came into play, the fact that this conversation is kind of coexisting with that, got clouded by the political maneuvering, you know, which was unfortunate. I think this conversation, you know, since the Me Too movement has been going on for, I don't know, roughly a year, it's been coming up. And that to me just says enough's enough. You know, it's time to start having these conversations. It's time to start looking at ourselves. It's time to start doing something, even if it's talking. And I know from experience, the women in my life that have suffered for their own reasons they didn't want to share. And so having this movement at least offers a percentage to voice that, so we can begin as a society to get an idea of what's really happening and not keep it pushed under the rug or not talked about and or excused, like boys will be boys, or, you know, that kind of nonsense. That's just horrific. So I think women have had enough, and I'm grateful to see that, you know, and I largely throughout this on a personal level, I've been quiet because I think it's just time to listen. You know, it's time for them to be heard. And as a white male, it's almost becoming like a liability, like I was born this way, I'm born into privilege, and it's become like almost socially unacceptable in the political correct sphere all of a sudden, you know, and it's not something I can change. And I kind of look at this and go, no, privilege shouldn't be something that some have and some don't. Everyone is sovereign human beings that I believe are divine, and they need to be honored and treated with care. So I think largely we're somehow disconnected from our hearts. We're disconnected from our humanity. We're disconnected from gender equality in a deep, deep sense for this to even be occurring.
Yeah, so you bring up some interesting points that I think, I'm trying to stay empathic. Well, first of all, I'm trying to stay also politically somewhat neutral in that I think this happens on both sides, right? The posturing can happen on both sides. There's obviously plenty of stories on both sides of the aisle where you can see problematic issues with sexual harassment, sexual impropriety, and sexual assault happening. We've also seen it obviously in the last year or two, affecting a lot of the media people, right? So movie stars and newscasters and all of these things. And so it can, because I think I'm trying to, step back and also kind of understand myself too in the process of it all. It's, on the one hand, I think because it is such a common occurrence, so 1 in 3 women share that they have some type of sexual assault in their history. So that's a huge amount of people.
That's huge.
And so when you have a movement and when you have like we are seeing kind of like people stepping up and saying, oh, you're going to share, that means, I think now I'm going to share. Well, I think now I'm going to share, and so it can feel like a tidal wave. And oftentimes when tidal waves happen, people take notice, which is great because I think we are noticing and also addressing things differently. And at the same time, I do want to make space for the fact that tidal waves can cause a little bit of fear. So I don't want to totally kryptonize the fear that men maybe are facing. Like, I think it's the same fear that I face maybe in the racial, sphere where, with the Black Lives Matter and all of that, it's like, well, am I complicit because I'm a white person? And what can I say as a white person? If I say anything, I'm going to be, I'm going to say it wrong, or I'm not going to say it right, or I need to educate myself, so all this pressure that comes up as a white person, because in a sense, the Black Lives Matters movement is saying, enough, right? Like enough, like we're not going to put up with this. This is a tidal wave. And so that makes me uncomfortable and maybe a little afraid, but that's okay for me to be uncomfortable and afraid because I have white privilege, right? And so I think, so I want to normalize that for men and at the same time say, it's okay that you have some discomfort and some fear because this is something that needs to be kind of talked about and looked at very, very differently than we ever have before. And challenged very differently. And I think I could say that I have participated in possibly racial issues that have been hurtful to some of my friends who are people of color. I'm guessing I have probably misstepped in some way or another. And I need to own that. And I need to say, I'm sorry. And I need to say, I'm willing to do better. And I think men are kind of in that position where more than likely, most men in this country have made a joke at a woman's expense or have made an inappropriate comment or, faltered some way in the consent department with girlfriends or, partners. And that's, I think, very difficult to own when we polarize. Like, if I own that, that's going to mean I'm going to be defined as a rapist, right? Or I'm going to be defined as something really, really atrocious. And I feel like I'm a generally good person, so I don't want to define myself as that. So I'm just going to deflect and deny and not take any ownership. And so I think, does that make sense? So it's kind of this complex space, right, of owning
very much with the so-called tidal wave of women's voices being raised. It's not exactly a safe space for a male to step into at that time because the pressure is coming from the other side in that way. And maybe it's just too soon for that, but as a male, I think, being accused of abusing a child or raping a woman is like a horror story, right? That somebody's word can upturn your life even though you're innocent. So I think it's more of an imagined fear than an actual reality. Although we know there are cases of false accusal, but that's what due process is for.
Mhm.
So yes, that is a concern, but that is not the concern. Right now, this is the issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, are there conversations that you're having with other men where you can see some of these gears shifting, or do you see, like, are you optimistic? Are you
Yeah,
pessimistic?
well, I don't know whether to be optimistic or not. I am optimistic in the fact that women's voices are being heard and they're banding together, because I think that's what's going to make the change. You know, when women insist on being treated better, insist that men be educated, when we begin to have these conversations, that's where the healing's going to take place. And as far as like stepping into the spotlight, so to speak, as a male or a white male in this wave, it might be a little difficult to do. I think now is the time to support. Now is the time to listen. Now is the time to ask, what can I do?
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate the call for, I do think that women, obviously women are sharing their voices, and but I guess one of the messages that we're sharing here is it doesn't just have to be up to women, right? It can be
Right.
up to you all as well, since most of this is instigated by males. And so it's kind of like that balancing act, like um again, kind of making the metaphor towards race. If I'm always expecting Black people or brown people to educate me, it's like, where's my ownership in that? I need to kind of step up and do my own work instead of just
Mhm.
expecting them to do the work for me. And so I think that's what this kind of show is about tonight, is calling men to do their work. And go ahead.
That's very important, and I think men in general need to look at themselves and their relationships with women. Period. Are they reaching emotional depth? Are they reaching um, intimacy, which requires trust, which requires respect? If they're not getting that in their relationships and in their families, they need to do some work.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, with that, we're going to finish with Facebook Live. Facebook Live, I'm tuning out. We're continuing the discussion for a bit longer, and we'll take questions, or I'm going to see if Todd has questions for me, and maybe discuss a little bit more about what we can do. So keep on joining us at patreon.com, Sex Talk with Natasha. You subscribe and you can continue to join us there. So we'll see you next week. Goodbye, Facebook.